Good morning and welcome to another Total Education Media Centre video. Today I'm going to talk about Kenneth Slessor's poem Out of Time. I want to talk about Out of Time, but more specifically I want to relate it to his work as a whole and the body of his work, and I think that's very important, and we need to really understand what we're aiming for when we look at Slessor's poems. And if we look at some of the criteria for a critical study and what we really do in a critical study, you need to argue with skill and with purpose about an interpretation of a poem. Now I'm going to give you a variety of interpretations of Out of Time today, and you may agree with some of it, you may agree with all of them, you may disagree with all of them, but really we need you to formulate and think about and critically analyse, which is what we are here for, the poem itself. We need to talk about the depth of understanding is really important, and I need you to show a real clear depth of understanding about the poem and where it fits in with his work. And I'm going to help you do that by giving a little bit of context at the start of this lecture. The other thing that we need to do is, develop our own theories and ideas about Slessor. And I think that this lecture will also help you do that, because I'm going to give you and talk about his most important themes and where he's coming from. I'd like to start by placing Slessor's poem and the latter body of his work in some kind of context for you, because Out of Time comes from that, and there are specific themes and ideas that Slessor has that stem from that period of time. I want to read you now, Francis Matthews has written a small piece about Slessor in a book, and I'd like you to think about where it comes from in his context in Australian poetry, so you can place it not only in the context of a time period. And can I recommend that if you haven't already watched the Slessor pretext and context video, you go back and do that, because that will be vital to your understanding. We have a whole body of lectures and videos and stuff on the website, but you need to really watch that one before you go any further with this one. So if you'd like to, you could stop the video now, go back, have a look at Slessor pretext and context, and then come back to this lecture at this point and develop those ideas. So what does Matthews say about Slessor in his work? He says, Kenneth Slessor found an answer in the poetic expression of personal vision. The truth of the individual became the focus of the work. This truth was to be found in fresh examination of the link between man and woman and their environment and between themselves. From this link came a special harmony, an understanding of life that took poetry and literature away from the mere documentation of society and war to a plane which saw social structure and historical events as part of a broader dimension. Human history, not just social and national history, became their focus. All of this they placed in the context of time and the cycles of birth and death, of creation and chaos, which were its essence. And that's particularly important when we look at Slessor and his work and the period of time that he's writing in. I think that you need to understand very clearly that Slessor's obviously main theme is, yes, it is about time, but Slessor's also got those other things worked in there. And I'd like to talk about that third period. Now, obviously, by now I'm hoping that you have watched that lecture, that Slessor's pretext and context lecture. And I'd like to talk about that third period that Slessor worked in, and Out of Time comes from that third period. And Out of Time, not so much maybe as Five Bells, but is sort of a culmination of his ideas and part of that growing development of that theory that we just talked about, that Matthews came up with, where those poets took the bigger picture and looked at those larger issues. And I read you here, it is Slessor's third phase that gives him his reputation as a poet, and you know that, and I've already talked about that. Generally speaking, the poems in this period are poems of impermanence. Themes such as sleep, death, the sea, and time are prominent. Slessor manages to fuse sense, sound, image, and feeling in much of the poetry of the period, and Out of Time is an excellent example of that. So that's a good concept to begin with, a good understanding and a good theory to work on. That development in Slessor's poetry reaches some sort of culmination in Out of Time, and other poems such as Five Bells, and you can work these ideas and theories into other poems. And obviously we'll do a lecture on 5 bells later on for you, but Now Out of Time is a great stepping stone to the longer poems. Now I'd also like to emphasise before I really begin looking at Out of Time that I don't have time in this lecture. Certainly I don't have time to read exactly what's going on in this lecture, the whole poem for you. I'd like to read it, and I'd like you to read it out loud. You don't have to read it obviously in front of a class or in front of an audience, but really it's worth reading out loud, because then you'll get that sound of the sea, that sound of the waves, and that feeling, that cyclical feeling he's trying to get into that poem. And it'll give you a better sense of how the poem flows and the rhythm of the words, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But let's look what Slessor does in this poem and what he puts into it. Now, Vivian Smith in the Oxford History of Australian Literature said that Slessor stands, as an icon in Australian poetry, and probably at the head of the poetry and in charge certainly of that group of poets. So what are his influences? What does he try and do? His thematic preoccupations are extremely important, and they are time, memory, and history. And I think you'll find those influence this poem very clearly. What does Slessor also do in Out of Time? He uses the landscape symbolically so that it also conveys a state of mind, and that's very true of Out of Time. He uses sardonic humour, questioning and puncturing allusions. It's usually about the city. It's more about the city than anything else. He incorporates European cultural heritage. And in the language, his sense of concrete in the particular. He uses sound as a way of creating meaning, and of course the ambivalences that we see in the poem. Now that's Vivian Smith's analysis of Slessor's poetry and all of Slessor's poetry, and I think you can specifically relate those to Out of Time very clearly. So there's some really good ideas to work through when you look at Out of Time. So what does Out of Time offer? Of course, the poem itself is about time and death, and we talked already in the lecture up to this point about how time and death are so important in what goes on in the lecture and in the poem, I apologise, and how it's developing along that way. Now what we also have in this poem is he uses an extended metaphor, of course, and that metaphor is about time as a wave with its water imagery to show time's relentless progress. Now, that's a general overview of the poem, the fact that it's about time of death, the fact that it's an extended metaphor, and I think you've probably worked that out. The glossary, of course, you need a glossary of terms, and probably meniscus is the most important one, and you need to work out all those words and what they mean in your own terms and in your own words. Sometimes it's not much use going to a dictionary and just getting a meaning. You need to work it out in the context of the poem. The structure of the poem is pretty clear. And what we've got here is that, I'll go back to Vivian Smith again, and she says, there's 3 rhyming and half-rhyming sonnets. Time is both a lover and a killer. Consciousness as at once within and out of time. The eye of the poem that he's looking through is a curved lens. That's the sweet meniscus of time. And she says a meniscus is the crescent lens. The second stanza of the 3rd sonnet amplifies this image. And you've got all those ideas blended into that poem. So as I said, the structure is about 3 sonnets, and a sonnet's 14 lines in structure. The rhyme scheme of this poem isn't complicated, but it might sound complicated when I read it, but go back over this. The rhyme scheme is AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and GG. And that's the same rhyme scheme for each of the sonnets, and each line has 10 syllables. So it's a very carefully and clearly constructed poem, and one that we need to pay particular attention to, because Slessor really has gone into it and given it his full poetic justice, I suppose what you'd call. And along with 5 Bells, Captain Dobbin, 5 Visions, all those sorts of poems, these are the culmination of years of writing and years of effort, and Out of Time is a good representative of that period. Obviously time's personified in the first, in this poem, and time is captured very clearly. We can look at the opening And Graham Kinross Smith, in another article in Ostlit, says of the opening of the poem, and Slessor makes a comment here in this article, and he quotes Slessor. And I think it gives a good indication about the lead into the poem and the guidance that we need. Graham Kinross Smith, in an article in Ostlit, says, Kenneth Slessor was a poet of the time, of the cold fact of time, as he said in describing the genesis of his magnificent poem, Five Bells. His poetry holds a music, a verbal polish, a perfection. In one of the rare moments when he spoke about his own work, he told his friend, Alexander MacDonald, that in the first two lines of Out of Time, he consciously chose the old English word foxed, meaning a bit tipsy, to describe the sails of yachts on Sydney Harbour. I had the idea of sails being just a bit drunk, drunk on air, he said. Again, Kenneth Slessor was the poet of Sydney, and particularly of its harbour. He spent only 6 years of his adult life away from it. The country inland from the coast held no magic for him at all. For Sydney and his particular living places, Elizabeth Bay and King's Cross, he has warm and magical words, whether he writes of them in prose or distills them further into poetry. For in fact, when he wrote of these places, he was writing of something that he knew in all its moods and in all his own, and yet yearned to know better. That goes a long way to explaining why he presented Sydney with such verbal magic and sharp visualisation. And that's what he does in this poem, Out of Time. Obviously, he's talking about the harbour and the ideas around the harbour. And we know from the first stanza here, where he personifies time, and the capital letter is an indication of that, that he's talking about how time is relentless. And they're relentless like the yachts pushing through the water. And then time in that stanza becomes a wave that moves on. And finally, in that first stanza, he addresses time directly in the final couplet. I want you to pay particular attention, and as I said, go back and read that poem out loud, and especially that first stanza, because you get a rhythm and a feel of what he's trying to achieve. In part two, obviously, you're going to talk about the link to the previous sonnet in the first line and explaining the continuous motion, and obviously the last line of the first sonnet is, and leave this lovely moment at your back. And then he begins the second stanza, time leaves the lovely moment at his back. And so there's that circularity and that rhythm to the poem that's particularly important. So in the second sonnet, or part two, we obviously have that link. And then he goes on to talk about how time affects all life. We have the image of the door that's very important, and that's the allusion to the opening and closing of doors, about opportunity in life. And then the hyperbole of 1,000,000 years, and that also represents time and that never-ending relentlessness of time. And that last line is leaning against his golden undertow. Well, that gives an excellent definition of the attempt to fight against time. And we all know that we can't hold back time, but Slessor discusses it and uses it. And we see in part three where the echo of the lines again occurs between that first and last line. This scene is fixed but still changing, and it's more like a photo, an image, a memory. And then the last couplet, again we go back to that cyclical structure. So what is it in this last stanza, this last sonnet, that draws back all those images? Well, Roderick Heath in his English blog spot talks a little bit about Out of Time, and he says about this last stanza, consider also an out of time where the moment's world as it was and I was part, fleshless and ageless, changeless, and that was made free. Slessor's concept of freedom seems precisely to invite a boundless disintegration of form, a complete immersion in the totality of things. The gulls go down, the body dies and rots, and time flows past them like 100 yachts. The physical world decays, and in the relentless march of time, there's no intimation of a god or an afterlife here. It's more as if time itself is the god, neither cruel nor pitying, but implacable. That Slessor envisions. And I think there that sums it up very, very well. And that time is an implacable thing that just moves completely on. And when we look at Out of Time, we can use all those ideas that I've talked about to link back to Slessor and also back to his other ideas. We're very, very short of time, and I'd like to certainly speak longer about Out of Time and go through a really clear analysis, but I'm sure that you've done that. What I've tried to do is develop it and build it and link it to all the other ideas. Don't forget, if you need further information, you can always go to our website and download a lecture for yourself from totaleducationcentre.com.au. I'd like to finish now very, very quickly with a reading of a paragraph from a student of mine who wrote an essay about Slessor and was talking about why this poem, Out of Time, would be representative of Slessor's work as a whole. And she wrote, "The themes of time and death, Slessor's favourite themes, are present in Out of Time. The water imagery present in most of Slessor's poems is present in this poem also. The image of the wave is linked to the path of time and its effects on everything. Being a harbour poet, there's also imagery of Sydney Harbour, as it is in some of his other poems. The largest feature of the poem, which makes it a good representation of his work, is the constancy of time contrasted with the variables of life." And I think that paragraph gives us a nice overview of how you can see the poem. And you mightn't agree with everything that we've talked about or said today, but certainly I hope these ideas have given you something to think about, and some of the quotes have built upon what you already know. Don't forget, Out of Time is one of Slessor's great poems, and a very important and particular as way of his development. Well, thank you for your time today. Thank you for letting me into your home and listening to one of our lectures. Don't forget to visit our website. Please press the like button down below so we can continue to make these videos. If you have any questions or comments, please include them. We will respond to you. Thank you and goodbye.